You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, Lisa Watson on the buttons. We have just completed the Jazz Zone, and T in Providence has been talking to Maurice Gordon, and they're talking about great guitarists, Grant Green and so on and so forth. And we're getting ready to talk to Dr. Gerald Horne, the Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And Dr. Horne is the author of dozens of books. And I know he wants to talk about, let me turn it over to Melinda Francis.
Yeah, let's get into Iran.
Well, I'm sure most of our audience recognizes that quite illegally, the United States began to bomb Iran yesterday, last night. That is to say, they bombed the facility at Fordow, at Natanz, and in Isfahan, the nuclear facilities. There has not been a bomb damage assessment that I find credible. There were reports previously that the Iranians were expecting this attack, and so they moved critical materials from these sites. So it's unclear if this has been the so-called spectacular success that the tangerine tyrant, Mr. Trump, projected last night when he announced this scandalous event. Obviously, this raises profound questions, and I must say, I'm having to restrain myself because I'm quite angry, like many across this small planet, about what's unfolding. I'm angry at the double standard, for example, that is to say that Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has opened itself up to scrutiny by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and as we have reported on this program previously, it turns out that Rafael Grossi, the Argentine who leads the IAEA, was likely passing on intelligence gathered in Iran to the Israelis and their partners in Washington, which is obviously outrageous. But it's also notable that Israel has nuclear weapons, is unlike Iran, is not part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so if you step back for a second and look at this scandal from 30,000 feet, it's easy to come to the conclusion that it's not accidental that these two settler states, the United States and Israel, are linking arms and linking hands to preserve the status quo, given the fact that the latest iteration of settler colonialism, speaking of Israel, is under unremitting pressure, not least since their illegal attack on Iran beginning June 13th, 2025. And in fact, I expect those attacks on Israel to continue. And you could make an argument that this may be a final gasp of settler colonialism. That is to say, to personalize this story, I spent a good deal of my time in Victoria, British Columbia, as we speak, reading about settler colonialism as it unfolded in what is now the state of Washington, the state of Oregon, and Northern California. I cannot tell you the times I've run across the phrase war of extermination rendered by the settlers in what is now the United States in the 1840s and the 1850s, to the point now where you talk to intelligent, otherwise intelligent, and even progressive people in the West, on the West Coast of the United States, who don't have a clue about the genocide They never heard of the Modoc War in Northern California, for example. They're not familiar with the fact that the indigenous were overwhelmed and liquidated. And so we see a similar process unfolding in historic Palestine, but of course the major difference is that the international situation has changed to the point now where the Iranian foreign minister will be in Moscow tomorrow conferring with President Putin, who, by the way, has authorized that the nuclear scientists from Russia who are busily constructing power plants continue at their station in Iran. We also have reported on this program previously about the fact that just before the bombing began, and in fact, June 13th, 2025, may have been sparked in no small measure by the fact that a railway from China to Iran has just been completed just before June 13th. And I would imagine, although I have not seen any reporting on it, that supplies from China are flowing into Iran to bolster that regime, just like we've had news reports about transport planes from China landing in Iran to bolster the regime, because I think that Russia and China recognize that U.S. imperialism and its partner in crime, speaking of Israel, probably think that just like in the late 1970s through the 80s, they poked the stick in a hornet's nest in Afghanistan and allied with religious zealots, speaking of U.S. imperialism, and that helped to start a brush fire on the border with Russia and the border with the Soviet Union, I should say, which was a contributing factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union. So perhaps they feel that in 2025, they can engineer regime collapse, if not regime change, but more likely their plot involves regime collapse in Iran, which will destabilize that part of West Asia to the detriment of Russia and China. Or alternatively, as we have said more than once on this program, this attempt by U.S. imperialism to turn back the hands of time might serve to be a distraction from their overriding goal of focusing on China. I think that in order to understand the upset amongst certain forces in the so-called MAGA base, speaking of Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's not as if they're doves. They feel that the focus should be on China and that anything else is a distraction. I should also say that I would hope and imagine that many of our left-wing friends should engage in a serious self-criticism. What I mean by that is that, as we noted previously, our left-wing friends, they oftentimes, they label any expression of Black self-assertion as identity politics, or they have a new term, identitarianism. As a matter of fact, it's quite striking. Mr. Trump, when he seeks to discredit high-level Black officials, they invoke the phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion. In fact, when you had the plane crash in Washington, he said that it was probably because of DEI. You know, people say when they get on a plane, they see a Negro pilot, they get nervous. They feel he's incompetent and unqualified for it. Well, I noticed our left-wing friends, when a Biden makes a Black appointee, they say that that's an identitarian appointee. I mean, it's the same thing. So you have, you know, the left-wing white nationalists and the right-wing white nationalists. And yet at the same time, you have Israel, the state based upon an exclusivist ethno-religious identity. And I've never heard one particularly Euro-American leftists, to be sure, slap the label identity politics or identitarianism on Israel. And it's that sort of ideological weakness that contributes to this crisis where we're staring into the abyss of World War III as we speak. I should also mention that many of our left-wing friends, they helped to pave the way for the attack on Iran because they were acting as cheerleaders, as useful idiots, to be sure, in terms of egging on the dislodging of the al-Assad regime in Damascus, Syria. Israel now says that when that regime was ousted a few months ago, they felt that this removal of an Iranian ally could be a stepping stone to dislodging the Islamic Republic of Iran altogether. And I must also say, I wonder what our friends in Istanbul and Ankara are thinking, because they were major players in the dislodging of al-Assad. I noticed that, as usual, President Erdogan was breathing fire this past weekend at a conference of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. But, you know, he should be engaged in some self-criticism because he helped to pave the way for this attack on Iran. Because keep in mind that if the U.S. and Israel are successful in regime collapse in Iran, that will egg them on, not only with regard to going after the big enchiladas, speaking of China and Russia, but it will egg them on as well towards perhaps seeking to seize more land from Syria, seize more land from Lebanon. I heard an activist mention the long history of Jewish people in Iraq, for example. Iraq is an artificial creation, unlike Iran, knocked together by the European forces post-World War I, approximately 100 years ago. Perhaps they would like to take a bite out of Iraq as well. And back to Ankara, their support for Azerbaijan, the former Soviet republic, needs to be brought into this discussion because, A, there is evidence to suggest that Azerbaijan, which is a neighbor of Iran, may have been complicit in terms of these Israeli attacks on Iran, not to mention the fact that a substantial percentage of the Iranian population is actually Azeri. And I would hate to think that that Azeri minority has been complicit with regard to the attack on Iran. And likewise, with regard to other countries in the region, I think that they're opening themselves up for destabilization. Speaking of the Gulf monarchs in the first instance, now to be sure, like Erdogan, they've been breathing fire, issuing statements, condemning Israeli aggression, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. But of course, you had Gulf monarchs who were signatories to the so-called Abraham Accords, which involved a warming of relations with Israel and tossing the Palestinian cause overboard. And once again, to return to the evil empire, speaking of the United States of America, I really continue to be disappointed, not only with the fact that there has not been a credible effort to establish an analysis that would help us to understand these tumultuous events of the last 12 to 24 hours, which would involve a deep dive into history, a deep dive into settler colonialism. And as I've said before, I don't think our Canadian friends have done us any favors because they are in a position to help us develop an analysis, but they don't even have our Canadian friends don't even have a credible analysis of republicanism. Notice, as I said, when King Charles III, the head of state, arrived in Ottawa at these Republican demonstrations, but how do Canadian leftists expect Canadian citizens, people, subjects, to flock to the banner of republicanism when you have a horrible advertisement for republicanism south of the border? Republicanism, speaking of anti-monarchy, we had this No Kings demonstration in the United States, which was successful. I supported it. I noticed that in Toronto it was called the No Tyrants demonstration. Obviously, any brand manager can tell you that you should have a consistent brand across the board for political purposes, if not purposes of negating confusion. And so, like an Agatha Christie mystery novel, there are many culprits with regard to ascertaining who is responsible for this crime against humanity, this bombing of nuclear facilities, which bids fair to release toxins into the air, replicating Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945. But alas, all is not lost, because despite the fact that poodle known as Sir Keir Starmer in London immediately endorsed this act of piracy by Israel and the United States against Iran, this conflict will help to unleash a further tensions in Europe. We've already made reference to the fact that just this past week, France was scheduled to host with Saudi Arabia a major conference at the United Nations that would have led to a step forward with regard to Palestinian self-determination. Obviously, that was scuttled. The French president also visited Greenland in order to buck up the Danes in terms of their seeking to repel a U.S. takeover of that gigantic island. We noticed that at the Alberta summit just this past week, that as Mr. Trump exited, he was in a verbal tiff with President Macron of France with regard to this conflict between Israel and Iran. Notice the past Princeton submarines have been spotted off the coast of Nova Scotia, not far distant from Boston. So there are many tensions that this conflict will unleash. I would like to think that it will end badly for the pirates in Tel Aviv and in Washington. And if so, that may once again put a final nail in the casket of settler colonialism, this ignominious system of piracy and slavery and indigenous dispossession, ethnic and racial supremacy that should have been buried decades ago, but hopefully will breathe its final breath sooner rather than later.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and Lisa Watson. We're speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne, I have a question for you. What position did the Bandung Conference in Manchester 1945 and the Pan-African number 5 in Manchester, England, and the Bandung Conference in 55, what were their positions on nuclear weapons?
Well, I don't recall specifically, but I can say that unfortunately, when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, there was not the kind of opposition that one might have imagined and expected, even from quarters that should have known better. I think it's because Japan was seen as an ally of Berlin and Rome, that the progressive movement opposed the Axis powers, and I take it that they also recognized that it was going to take more than a notion to get Japanese forces to retreat. I mean, I'm finishing up the final pages of my first book of 2026, The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the why coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism in the Asia-Pacific basin. And so I'm writing about the Bandung Conference, where Richard Wright, the novelist, attended, Adam Clayton Powell attended, a number of other Black American personalities attended, not all of whom were on the right side of history. I'm writing about the bloody coup overthrowing Sukarno in 1965. So these events are very much on my mind today. And going through all of the pages that one has to go through to write about these events, I don't recall seeing that much material on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, of course, post 1945, you had the Stockholm Peace Appeal led by Du Bois, including Robeson, which sought to outlaw nuclear weapons. That became a cause célèbre of the left post 1945.
Padmore, I think, mentioned something. I have to go back and read Padmore has something to say. Pan-Africanism or communism had something to say about the nuclear weapons, but I remember this is Walter Rodney's anniversary of Walter Rodney's assassination. Walter Rodney, his critique of Padmore was that it should have been called Pan-Africanism and communism, not or, you know.
I see.
But Melinda, you have a question?
Yeah, I don't know if you want to go into the PRC.
Well, China is in a very ticklish position right now. As noted, even as Trump bombs Iran, and by the way, do not be surprised if evidence eventually leaks out that would confirm what Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada has called the monetizing of hegemony, or put it another way, the monetizing of the White House. That is to say, do not be surprised if Mr. Trump receives some sort of inducement, some sort of material inducement in order to unleash the U.S. military against Iran. I mean, this is the sort of country we're living in. And given the fact that the Supreme Court has told us that in the execution of presidential duties, it's well nigh impossible to bring any sorts of criminal charges against Mr. Trump, even if he took a bribe to send U.S. pilots and U.S. nuclear submarine officers into the zone of conflict off the coast of Iran. And once again, even though it opened me up to the charge of being sounding like a broken record, I have to return to this point that's too often neglected, and which is that in the settler colonial regime in the United States of America, and to a certain degree in Israel too, they're based upon class collaboration. That's the only way you can, that's one of the few ways you can understand the electoral results of November 2024. That's one of the few ways you can understand how 77 million voted for Mr. Trump in the first instance, including a significant number of settler descendants in the working class and middle class, which leads us to the other point, which once again, I implore my friends in Canada and the comrades in Canada to take up, which is that we really need an international movement to corral U.S. imperialism, given the constellation of forces domestically. After all, it took an international movement led by Haitian revolutionaries to subdue slavery in the 19th century. It took the rise of a socialist camp led by the Soviet Union to induce the U.S. rulers to move away from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow beginning in the 1950s. And I hope and I trust that our friends and comrades in China recognize that their strength notwithstanding, the strength of the People's Liberation Army notwithstanding, that their road ahead will be less rocky to the extent that they are able to help us develop an international movement, because that's the import of this attack on Iran. It's unleashing the most bloodthirsty, animalistic tendencies amongst the imperialists, amongst the settler leaders. I think, once again, if they are successful in engineering regime collapse in Iran, they will not stop there. They will be moving on to other targets, because Israel has already made clear, that is to say, Prime Minister Netanyahu has made clear that he is displeased with the fact that Pakistan has nuclear weapons. I take note of the fact that India has not stood tall with regard to this Iran-Israel conflict, and that Pakistan might be next on the chopping block with an alliance targeting it that includes Israel and India, perhaps even U.S. imperialism. I noticed that just last week, the head of the Pakistan Army was meeting with Mr. Trump in the White House. Reasons for that meeting unclear, although the meeting may have been scheduled before June 13th, 2025. In fact, it's likely. So in any case, we are on the threshold possibly of a political volcano that could erupt quite dangerously and quite damagingly at any moment. And certainly, I understand that there are going to be protests erupting in North America about this war. And I'm sure our audience will be in the forefront of these protests.
How do you deal with the fact that a day after condemning Trump's problem with Iran, Pakistan has nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize?
Pakistan government or Pakistan personalities?
I'm reading the headline from Al Jazeera. I'm just looking at the headlines. So it came out of Reuters.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, let's assume, without deciding, that it's Pakistani officialdom. Like I just suggested with regard to Mr. Trump, he has a fragile ego. He has a voracious appetite when it comes to profiteering. Perhaps the Pakistani authorities assume that he can be bought off by various means, and that has led to this story that you're seeing in Reuters. But in any case, it may reflect the short-sightedness of some in West Asia. I mentioned a moment or two ago about what's happening with regard to Ankara. They were rather short-sighted in helping to pave the way for this Israeli attack on Iran by destabilizing Iran's comrades in Damascus. Perhaps the Pakistanis are being short-sighted as well, but I'd have to do a deeper dive in order to come up with a reasonable explanation.
The last question is tonight of NBA. Who do you have? You have Siakam, and coming from Toronto, used to play with the Raptors. His team and our brother from Antigua, and the Antiguan Roots brother from OCK. Who do you have winning tonight's final?
Well, I take it that they're playing in Oklahoma City, OKC, and
Yes.
so I think that OKC, the Thunder, has the home court advantage, and therefore they'll emerge triumphant. But Indianapolis, obviously, they've proven a tough nut to crack, and I will not be disappointed if my prediction does not prove to be accurate.
And what do you think about Siakam in terms of how he has developed as a basketball player? Because he didn't start playing basketball until he was, I guess, in his late teens. If I'm not, he came out of he's from Cameroon, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, he's very good. I mean, he's a good rebounder, a good shooter, good team player. Indianapolis has a good team. You know, they have a deep bench, just like OKC has a deep bench.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the series is tied 3-3.
And Siakam was a community man. He would come into there's a hat store up here called Big It Up, and he used to go in there. He was very active among. You might see Siakam anywhere in Toronto. He was a very community-oriented type of guy.
Right on.
Is there anything else you would like to add, sir?
Well, only that I hope that I can divert my anger into fruitful channels, and I take it that our audience will be able to do the same.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Good luck.
All right. I'd like to thank Lisa Watson for keeping us on track, keeping us on time, and helping us with all of the technical problems that we face. And some of it might be or may not be sabotage, but we got through another show today. And what say you, Melinda Francis?
Sorry, I was on mute again. So,
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.